On December 13, 1937, Japan's Imperial Army entered China's then capital, Nanjing. What happened next has been the subject of an often poisonous dispute ever since. Western and Chinese historians believe the Japanese went on a 6-week spree of rape, torture and mass slaughter. Japanese historians say the claims are wildly exaggerated. Some even claim they are outright lies fabricated by China. In this edition of 101 East, we examine both sides and ask, does Japan still need to atone for its past? Increasingly, the history wars over the Nanjing massacre are being fought through the cinematographer's lens. Last year, an American film, simply titled Nanking, became China's most watched documentary. And in the next few months, a Japanese film called The Truth About Nanjing is bound to cause even more tension between the two old foes. Backed by Japanese nationalists and directed by Satoru Mizushima, the film denies the Nanjing massacre ever occurred. Howell Davis reports.
One event, two films, and the scripts couldn't be more different. No one disputes the Japanese conquered the Chinese city of Nanjing more than 70 years ago.
It was hell today.
They raped, looted and killed at will.
What happened during the conquest is detailed both in a new US-produced documentary, Nanking, and a revisionist Japanese drama. The American film tells of how Japanese troops murdered and raped tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of civilians. Some of Hollywood's biggest names tell the story using accounts from the era.
One can't help feeling that leaving right now would be passing up an opportunity for service of the highest kind.
But these eyewitness statements are explicitly denied in the new Japanese drama, The Truth About Nanjing. It examines the post-war execution of 7 key Japanese military figures, comparing them to the heroic 7 samurai of the classic Akira Kurosawa film. They include the officer with overall control of the army in Nanjing in 1937, General Iwane Matsui, presented in the film as a martyr. For the director of the Japanese film, the massacre is a lie, a smear against both a proud army and the nation as a whole.
First of all, the film is for the honor and pride of the Japanese people. Chinese people have a long history of carrying out massacres, but Japan has almost no history of carrying out massacres against other people. Absolutely none.
Mitsushima argues that almost all those killed by Japanese forces in Nanjing were soldiers. Almost no civilians died, he says, but Chinese troops did dress up as non-combatants in order to hide among the civilian population.
They took off their uniforms, but they kept their weapons, their machine guns, grenades and bombs, and hid themselves among the civilians. Then they carry out daily guerrilla attacks, setting fires, robbing and raping.
It's an argument, blaming the Chinese for the vast majority of atrocities against civilians, that's at odds with much of the oral testimony. Matsuoka Tamaki, a primary school teacher, has spent years searching for Japanese soldiers and Chinese survivors who were in Nanjing at the time of the massacre. Her interest was first sparked when she realized her students were not being taught about Japan's role during the 1930s in China. She estimates that she's interviewed 150 soldiers, almost certainly more than anyone else. Most, she says, are initially reluctant to talk, but after repeated interviews, they often open up about the crimes they committed. This soldier even talked about the gang rapes his unit committed. The ink Chinese women and girls smeared on their faces in a desperate attempt to put off the soldiers attacking them.
A number of men would hold down a woman. They draw straws to decide the order in which they would rape her. The first one would wipe her face before she was raped because her face was covered in ink. 5 or 6 would take it in turns.
Most Japanese will acknowledge that mass killings did take place in 1937. But at the first showing of The Truth About Nanjing, it's obvious there's an audience for the opposite view. Japanese lower house member Shingo Nishimura says that the Chinese government uses the issue of the Nanjing massacre to distract the Chinese people from its own crimes.
つまり具体的に言うならば中国共産党はですね
The Chinese Communist Party, in order to take power, and after they had gained it, killed many people. If the Chinese people knew the truth, the party wouldn't survive. So the Communist Party spreads propaganda that really it's Japan that's the big aggressor.
Such attempts to deflect Japanese responsibility for the killings in Nanjing may seem crude, but they reflect, according to some analysts, a failure to come to terms with the crimes committed during the 1930s and 40s.
Compared to Germany, Japan has not clearly expressed regret about the invasions. Unlike Germany, Japan did not show its regret after the war. So that is why this issue keeps coming up. I think this is a big problem.
Such a failure might be thought to only be of consequence to extreme nationalists. But former Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi's frequent trips to the Asukuni Shrine, which honours convicted war criminals as well as other war dead, soured relations between China and Japan for many years. And until there is an accurate reckoning of Japan's role in the 1930s and 40s, further bitter disputes will sour the country's relations with other Asian nations, as well, experts say, as empowering an ugly political fringe in denial about the truth.
Well, joining me in our studio is the Japanese historian and social commentator Hideaki Kase. On the satellite from Rochester in New York, Richard Chu, a specialist in modern Asian history. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. There appears, let me begin with you, Mr. Kase, there appears to be a number of new documentaries coming out regarding the events in Nanjing, one of which you have had a hand in. Give us a little bit of detail as to what that documentary will argue and what it will contain.
Well, there are going to be three films, two documentaries and one feature film produced by the same director on the so-called Nanjing incident.
Mm-hmm. And they all have the same basic premise?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Which is that the alleged massacre of Nanjing did not take place.
Let's be entirely clear about what you mean by that. Did not take place insofar as there were no deaths at all?
No massacre.
Okay. What does massacre mean to you?
Illegal killing of civilians against the international law or the Geneva Convention.
So the deaths that occurred there were within the realms of the Geneva Convention?
That's right.
And they were all of military personnel?
Yes. Very few civilians were killed.
Very few civilians?
Yeah. Yes. I can give you many proofs.
Well, let's just take the basic premise first and throw it over to Richard Chu for a reaction to that basic comment.
You want me to make a comment on there was no civilian casualty, only military? Is that what I caught?
And well,
yes,
and within the bounds of the Geneva Convention as well. That was the contention.
2 points I want to make. One, of course, I'm familiar with the Japanese right-wing writers or politicians try to divide the victims into several categories. Among them, there's one category are the soldiers in civilians' clothes. If that is, all the civilians are considered as soldiers in civilian clothes, then I don't think we have a common definition of anything. Therefore, this conversation cannot even be carried on. And the second, I would say, is among the international communities in Nanjing who were first-hand witness to what's happening there, or made reports, have their personal diaries, their personal correspondence with their friends and families, their reports to their board, and also journalists of New York Times, Manchester Guardian, and all those people were actually, most of them, witnessed in the Tokyo trial.
Let's take that second point first.
Yes, right.
Let me expand on that. Not only were there Western observers, Chinese observers, but some of the Japanese themselves, members of the Japanese Imperial Army, have come out in their own personal memoirs with statements that corroborate what appears to be the generalized line of what happened in Nanjing. And let me just read you a quote from Tilman Durden of the New York Times at the time. "I climbed over masses of bodies. There was a group of smoking, chattering Japanese officers overseeing the massacre of a battalion of Chinese troops. They were marching about in groups, machine gunning them." Now, there are any number of quotes that I can read you along those lines, given by a broad range of people who were at the time. So,
yes,
well,
let me refer to the Nanjing safety zone, which was managed by an international committee. And the report published in Shanghai the next year cites the population of the safety zone as 200,000 just before Nanking fell to the Japanese forces, and a month later the population increases to 250. And outside of the international safety zone, in the city, within the wall.
So there are discrepancies. You're drawing attention to discrepancies in stated populations at the time, which we'll come on to in just a second. But could I just ask you to address the issue of why there are so many personalized documents about what happened there from any number of different nationalities and different residents at the time?
They're not fully trustworthy, aren't they?
All of them?
Most of them.
Yeah.
Most of them. But,
okay, I got your point. I got your point. You mentioned that many Japanese soldiers were actually collaborating with the Chinese. Is that correct?
No.
Are you accusing many of those Japanese soldiers collaborating with the Chinese, creating rumors against Japan's interests? I couldn't believe it.
But,
I couldn't believe. Do you believe that? You watch out for the Veterans Association in Japan. Mr. Kaze, I just warn you. You watch out to your Veterans Association. Let me quote one person, not soldier, okay? Let me quote one person. July 1938, General Okamura, you know, Yasuki Okamura, you know who he is, the Supreme Commander in China Field. You know, in his book, published in 1970 in Tokyo, page 291. Do you know what he said? During the Battle of Nanjing, it was a fact. Thousands of Chinese civilians, thousands of Chinese civilians were what? Were committed robbery and rape by the Japanese soldiers. You check his book, Data, page 291.
Mr. Chu, could you please allow for a different perspective here? That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to this international committee which managed Nanking safety zone, their document lists 26 incidents of Japanese Army's criminal activities, murders, and only one was witnessed. And it is clearly stated that even this only one example was within the bound of international legality.
But
only 26 incidents.
Well, you are quoting a couple of minor quibbles in historical documentation.
No, sir.
What we are presenting before you is, in fact, reams and reams of documents that really do outweigh the couple of points that you mentioned.
Then,
and you haven't addressed the point.
Let me cite another example.
You're suggesting that all those individuals,
unrelated
individuals who documented events in Nanjing are all wrong.
I'm quoting the Japanese soldiers. I'm quoting those people. In other words, you can see, you can see here, I give you the military and the Japanese during the wartime, and they saw what they did. You know this Azuma Shiro, and he was participating. He's a member of the 16th Division, one of the 3 major divisions in Nanjing Massacre. You know what he said? He was in his diary. The killing and the raping was basically what they do.
Okay.
Yes,
Professor, pause there for a minute.
If
I can pause just for a minute. We're going to have to fit in a short break.
Yes.
So we'll get back to this in a couple of minutes when we've had a chance to take a few deep breaths, and we'll join you again in a couple of moments. Do stay with us.